There's one thing, though, that you should know. Another identity that will help you sort all these things out is to understand some details of the book of Revelation. We're not going to go through that whole book, but there's a couple of basic things you need. There are some lampstands that show up in chapter 1, and they are clearly in verse 20 of chapter 1 identified as the church. Jesus himself makes that quite clear. It's an idiom, if you will, for the church. When in the first verse of chapter 4, John arrives in heaven, somehow transported there in time, and the lampstands, when John gets to heaven, are in heaven when he arrives. People miss that. We discover the church occurs only in 2 chapters. In chapter 1, there's a vision of Christ, which defines these terms. Then chapter 2 and 3 are 7 letters to 7 churches. Chapter 4, verse 1 is the checkpoint after which the rapture has taken place. And so, furthermore, the other group you run into in chapter 4 and 5 and on are the 24 elders. And if you're going to study the Revelation, you need to satisfy yourself you really understand who they represent. And they clearly identify themselves as the redeemed. And they make that very clear. But if they worship the Lamb before he receives the scroll with the 7 seals. The tribulation begins when the scroll is unsealed, which means that the elders are there with him prior to the tribulation. One of the big debates that goes on in eschatology is this tribulation issue. And I'm showing you the reason we've taken the view we have. Not everybody does. Some good scholars see it differently. The 70th week, we believe, is detailed for us from chapter 6 through 19 of Revelation. But it's all post chapters 2 and 3. Whatever it is, we're going to see it from the mezzanine is the point, okay? So one of the things that's understudied, I think, is the precision in the prophetic profile of Jesus. How many epistles in the New Testament? Well, there's 21, right? 14 by Paul and 7 others, right? Wrong. There's 7 you would never count. The 7 by Jesus Christ. The 7 letters, 7 churches, Revelation 2 and 3. They're dictated by him. And so we'll take a look at those. We have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Why those 7? Several of those you've never heard of before. Why did he pick those? It turns out he picked them for some incredibly fascinating reasons. Because it turns out that they're very instructional in terms of information for the church, the little churches. They're also very useful for us personally. I'm going to skip all that for here. It turns out we also discover that they lay out in advance the history of the church. And if they were in any other order, it wouldn't be true. Ephesus seems to speak of the apostolic church very clearly as we look at Acts 20 and we look at Paul's epistle to Ephesus. It all ties together. Smyrna is the persecuted church. Smyrna is a synonym for myrrh or an embalming ointment. And that's the persecuted church. Pergamos is the married church, not bigamy or pergamy. Pergamy is a perverted marriage. Bigamy is 2, monogamy is 1. Pergamy is a perverted, and that's when the church, what Satan couldn't accomplish by persecuting the church, he accomplished by having the church marry the world. And that occurred quite radically in the 3rd and 4th century. Thyatira is the medieval church. Now, incidentally, the Protestant commentators have had a field day trying to tie Thyatira to the Vatican. Well, and that's the longest letter, and there's lots of things to study if you like. But the point is, if Thyatira is the Vatican, then Sardis must be the Reformation. And it turns out that the Sardis is the church. You have a name, but you're dead. It's one of 2 letters that has nothing good said about it. Ooh, that may deserve some more study. Philadelphia is the missionary church. It's the good guys, so to speak. There are 2 churches that have nothing bad said about them, Smyrna and Philadelphia. So, and then, of course, Laodicea is the apostate church. And as you study these letters, you'll quickly become overwhelmed with the evidence that you and I are in the period of the apostate church. And so, for what that's worth. But there's much more here than most people study. We notice that the postscript, the ending of each of these letters is a phrase, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. But strangely, the first 3, that postscript is, that ending phrase is postscripted. The promise to the overcomer is outside the letter. Each one of these has a promise to the overcomer, and my wife will be talking about those in one of the subsequent sessions. But it's interesting that the promises to the overcomer are subscripted outside the letter, like a postscript, in the first 3. But in the last 4, the promises are in the body of the letter. That catches our attention. See, if you have the premise that we approach the text with, that nothing in there is by accident, everything's there deliberate and for design. Why? Well, we also notice not only are the promises in the body of the letter, we discover something else by inspecting these carefully. The last four have explicit references to the second coming. And that causes us to again begin to understand how these things parse. Because Thyatira, for an example, is promised that it will go into the Great Tribulation if it doesn't get its act together. Which, by the way, confirms our view that if the church is on its toes, it won't see the tribulation, the Great Tribulation. And so, Philadelphia, in contrast, that is promised that it will be removed before the time of the tribulation. So that is a branch point. What happens to the others two, we're not sure. That's problematical. So for what it's worth, that's worth studying. I just want to highlight that for your own study. And Jesus in Matthew, at the famous Olivet Discourse, says, "Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh." So the more certain you are that he's not coming means the more certain he probably is. I'll leave that with you.